Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti. I am MrPhotographer.com. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how a professional will go about processing and color grading an image. We're going to start out with an image that looks like this and end up with an image that looks like this. I have well over 1,000 videos on YouTube, and I would bet almost half of those are on Lightroom. But of my Lightroom videos, very few are geared toward the professional. Most of them are for the enthusiast or beginner photographer. In this video, I want to talk about how a professional might go about processing this image with an emphasis on color grading. Obviously, it's an engagement session, and even though I consider this like advanced, something a professional would look to do. I mean, I think anyone would benefit from this. And also, I want to start out with something very basic, something that I think is often not said. What we're doing as a photographer, or if you're even a painter, what we're trying to do is we're trying to depict the 3D world onto a 2D object. In the case of the painter, they're trying to depict their 3D world on a canvas, 2D object. We photographers are trying to depict our 3D world onto either a computer monitor or a printed photograph. That's the very basic essence of this. We're trying to depict this 3D object on this 2D object. And what's different though between the painter and the photographer is the painter starts out with a blank canvas and they build their painting. Whereas we photographers, we start out with this messy world and we're actually selecting our photo. And in the case of this scene, when I was there, I want to minimize the parts in the scene that are bad and try to emphasize or maximize the things in the photo that are in the scene that I think would benefit my 2D photo. The light was really bad. It was very bright, harsh light. So I wanted to minimize the light, so I placed them in the shadows, in the shade. Also, I wanted to try to depict some of that 3D depth that was in the scene. I mean, we have mountains or hills out in the background, and we have some trees and grasses here, and then this kind of larger grass field. So I have all this kind of depth. So I wanted to make sure that I kind of was able to depict this in my depictive space. My depictive space, or the depictive level as often called, is my photograph. So I have them framed in such a way to try to show that. Now, one thing that is, I won't call it a mistake, it was unavoidable, is I have this ridge line coming through his head here. That's undesirable. I would have preferred to have his head totally below that, but I just couldn't get up high enough. So it is what it is. So I have to deal with it. But it still doesn't ruin the image. Again, whereas a painter has total control of what they put on their blank canvas, I had to work with what I had. So I minimized it as much as possible. I minimized the harsh light. I minimized that as much as possible to try to get a very pleasing scene. Now, so this is called the depictive scene, the depictive space. So this is the way I chose to depict it. Now in post-processing, I could add to that as well. Now I know they wanted prints. They want prints. So I wanted to make sure that when I took this photo that I didn't underexpose it, because if you underexpose an image, especially in the darkest parts of the image, you introduce a lot of noise. So I wanted to minimize noise. So I made sure that the image was either properly exposed or even slightly overexposed. In this case, I think it's properly exposed. Also, I have my Lightroom set up in such a way that when I import images into it, nothing gets pre-adjusted. In many cases with Lightroom, when you import images, it will automatically add some sharpening and some color noise reduction. I don't want that. I want control over everything, basically. There's a way you could set up your Lightroom so it will do that. And I actually did a video on it. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, over here in the right-hand corner, a little flag will pop up with a link to that video if you're interested in watching it. In the description below this video, I'll also have a link to that video as well if you want to take a look at it. Now, I have it exposed properly. I have Lightroom set up so it didn't pre-adjust to anything. I have control over every single pixel. The first thing I do, though, is I go to lens corrections. Right away, I'll click on remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. I do that right away because especially with enable profile corrections, it tends to brighten the outer edges of the image. And I'm going to be processing the outer edges differently than I do the middle of the image. And if I don't do this early, right now, whatever processing I do will be wrong because I didn't do this. So do it now, get it over with. The next thing that a professional will do is their white balance. All your colors will be off if the white balance isn't correct. Now, in the case of this image, I think the white balance was pretty good, but what I will do anyway is I'll get the eyedropper tool and I'll click on something white. And I'll click on his white shirt. And it just barely adjusted white balance. I'm going to undo that by hitting Command Z. If you have a PC, hit Control Z. So we're back to where we as shot. I'll get this eyedropper again and watch these two temp and tint sliders right here. I'll click on his white shirt and you can see it barely adjusted him. So white balance was pretty good in camera. Next, I'll adjust the tone of the image. And what I do is I look at the image and see what is it need most. Well, the sky's really bright, so I think it needs highlights brought down. So I'll go to the highlight slider and move this down, and I'll just keep moving it till I'll look. And you can see I'm bringing all this detail back into the highlights. And I think -100 is fine. Now, I don't move every image to -100. I move it, I just look and see how it looks. In this case, bringing it down that far brought out all the detail in the sky. Next, I'll go to shadows and I'll open those up a little bit. Now, what I'm tending to do and what professionals will do is early in their processing like this, they'll flatten the image out. So you're bringing the highlights more towards midtones and you're bringing the shadows more towards midtones. That in effect is flattening the image. You're removing contrast from it. And the reason why we do that is we prefer then to add contrast to the image with the whites and black sliders. And to do that, I hold the Alt or Option key in. It's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. Click on the whites slider. Move that to the right till I see some colors coming through. You can see reds and greens coming through, then white. Then some blue up there too. That means you're clipping those color channels, red, green, and blue. And when you see white, that means you're clipping all three color channels. When you're clipping that channel or clipping all three, that means you're losing all detail. I prefer to have details in my highlights, so I will move the whites slider until all those colors just disappear, which is right there. +8, so a very minor whites adjustment. Similarly, I will go to blacks. I will hold the Alt or Option key, click on blacks. This time the screen turns totally white. And you can see I'm already clipping some colors over there, some color channels. I prefer to clip my blacks a little bit. So you can see I'm clipping the green channel and I got some black in there, so I'm clipping all three channels. That's fine the way I like to process. I like a lot of tonal depth in my image, so I'll clip the shadows a little bit, but I don't like to clip the whites as much. Now, if you ever heard of the zone system that was popularized by Ansel Adams, this is where he talks about how the tone in the image, now he shot black and white mainly, and he has the tones. He wants like tone in his image. He wants something white all the way to black in his image, and it gives you a lot of tonal depth. Personally, most of my images, at this point in my processing, I want some blacks, but no absolute white. So just shy of absolute white. That's the way I like to do it. And the reason why I do it that way is because most professionals, we will selectively brighten parts of our image. So if I already have some whites or some white or highlights clipping, and I start to brighten other parts of the image, I'll clip them even worse. So you'll see in a moment what I mean, but right now this is what I like. So I'm really done with the tone. Now we got this presence section down here, and many photographers, especially with this new texture slider, which is awesome, they'll just kind of push it up, and then we'll push clarity up, and that in effect is kind of really sharpening everything. And many novices, they really like their image sharp from the very front part of the image all the way to the back. And we talked about the depictive space, the depictive level. This is what you as a photographer choose to include in the frame and how it's depicted, you depict it in your frame by processing it. But there's also something called the mental level or the mental space. That is the viewer of your image. When they look at your image, where do their eyes go? You have control over their mental space, their mental level, their mental process when they look at your image, believe it or not. Now, two things to keep in mind. If it's sharp everywhere, there's nowhere for their eyes to rest. So they'll tend to look at it, and yes, it's sharp everywhere. It may look awesome, but there's nowhere for their eyes to rest. And mentally, and probably subconsciously, it won't be as appealing to them. So it is better to have parts of your image not as sharp, so that when they look at it, they have a place to rest their eyes. To them, then it will be a more pleasing image. Also, as far as color is concerned, vibrance and saturation, a lot of beginning photographers like to just saturate everything. Oh, bring out all these rich colors. Well, again, the mental space, you have control over this. When the viewer looks at it, if everything is saturated or very colorful, there's nowhere for their eyes to rest. Then they subconsciously, most often, won't like your image. It won't be as appealing to them. So what you want to do is make sure that you don't overdo texture, don't overdo clarity, and definitely don't overdo vibrance and or saturation. Typically, you'd rather target those areas, meaning you want to selectively sharpen parts of your image, selectively blur parts of your image, selectively colorize or add saturation to parts of your image. I shouldn't say colorize. You definitely want to selectively add saturation to your image and selectively desaturate parts of your image. This way, you're controlling the mental space of the viewer. You're basically dictating to them where to look and where to rest their eyes, and the image overall will be more appealing. So, it may surprise you that many professionals don't do texture, clarity, or dehaze at all. And if they do vibrance and saturation, it's usually just vibrance, and it's usually very low, like 10. So just very little vibrance. And in case you don't know the difference between vibrance and saturation, saturation will saturate or desaturate every single pixel equally. So even if you have a color that's saturated and you move vibrance up, it's going to oversaturate the color. Vibrance, on the other hand, will bring colors to saturation, but will not oversaturate any colors. Also, it doesn't affect yellows and oranges as much as it does the other colors. So it will not affect skin tones as much. So it's a better choice when you have people in the shot. So in this case, I'm really done with the basic panel. I didn't add any contrast. You may think that's crazy. I just did these 4 sliders here, and I added vibrance to +10. I added no texture, clarity, and dehaze. Crazy, right? Well, I want to selectively add texture and sharpening where I want it. So what I'm going to do is get a brush, and we'll double click on Effect to reset these sliders. And what I want to do is I want to bring more emphasis on them. So I'm going to bring exposure up a little bit, and I'm going to add a little texture, and I'm going to add a little sharpness, and I'm going to keep auto mask on, and I'm going to click on his face, his skin, and I'm going to brighten up their skin. Now, I kind of screwed up. Let me undo that. Hit Command Z, and I'll do it again. I have auto mask on again, so I'm mainly doing his skin. I'll come over here and do her face. I'll do her arm. I'll do his arm. I'm not going to do their legs. I mainly want people to look up here. And I think it's a tiny bit too bright, so I'll bring this down. Now, in past videos, I've said that sharpening is overrated. And what I kind of is just an offhand comment more as a joke. But it's not overrated. It's important. But to sharpen everything is overrated. You want to selectively sharpen. And even when I took the image in camera, I was very conscious of the depictive space. So if I zoom in, you'll notice they're very sharp. But I didn't make, I mean, it starts to, sharpness drops off. So I used an aperture that was such that didn't make everything in focus. So the background, the clouds are slightly out of focus. This really naturally gives the viewer somewhere for their eyes to rest. In the description below this video, I'll have all my gear settings I used if you have an idea of how I went about doing this. So I selectively just sharpened and brightened their face. Okay, so there's that. Now we start to work with color a little more. I want to selectively add saturation, add luminance or decrease luminance, or remove saturation from various parts of the image. Generally speaking, when you're color grading, if you have an area that has a lot of color, like in this case we have the grass, right? There's a lot of green. Generally speaking, you don't want that saturated that much. You want saturation pulled away a little bit on that. If you have areas that are very small but important, you want to increase saturation there. Also, you tend to not, since you already adjusted white balance and you're not doing a fantasy image, like, all bets are off if you're doing art. But if we're doing this and we're going to be, they want a print of this, we want the colors to be right. So we're not going to mess with you usually at all when you color grade. So in this case here, we have all this grass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the HSL color tab, because here I can control the saturation and luminance, and I could target it to specific parts of the image, unlike the saturation and vibrance sliders, which affect every single pixel. So I'll go here and I will go to saturation first. I'm going to go to this targeted adjustment tool. And one thing I got to mention real quick is that the professional adjustments are very slight. They're not, usually you won't see sliders moved in extreme areas. Now I did bring what was it, highlights all the way down in this case, but usually it's very subtle, because the mental space is a very powerful, people don't really realize how they look at an image. So you just need to do things subtly. And although it might not be so overtly perceptible that it's there, their mind knows it's there, and it will make them look where you want them to look, and it will make the overall image pleasing to them. So I'm going to go to saturation, and because there's all this green grass in here, I want to bring saturation down a little bit. So I'm going to click with the left mouse button, the cursor will disappear, and I'll pull down slightly. And just bring in a little bit of saturation out, and you can see it move the green and the yellow. Now, the sky, there's a big part of sky there. It's not very saturated already, so I don't have to worry about saturation, but I do want to make it a little darker. It's a little bright. So I'm going to go to luminance, and I'm again going to use that targeted adjustment tool. Click on the blue sky. Cursor disappears. Pull down with my mouse just to darken that sky a bit. So we bring that a little bit darker. So I've taken some saturation out of the grass. I've removed some of the brightness from the sky. Now I want to go to the saturation now of his pants. They're kind of drab, right? Now this is kind of got, it's tan, right? So we'll go to saturation. I got the targeted adjustment tool. I'll click there. It's going to affect yellows and orange. You see that? Now that could affect their skin tone too. So I want to be careful I don't go too far. It's going to affect those grasses in the background, which are mainly yellow and whatnot. So we want to just bring those up. Yellow's enough. Now I like what it's doing to the grass in the background. It's kind of warming that up, it looks. And I just don't want to mess up their skin tone. So I kind of like that. So I selectively put saturation where I wanted it, and I put remove saturation from where I didn't want it, and I added or removed brightness from where I wanted to remove it. So very selective. Still, the image is very colorful. I think you'd have to agree, despite vibrance only being at +10, it was a RAW file to begin with. It's not like it was a JPEG, had any in-camera processing. All right, now I need to put more emphasis on them. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a radial filter. And what I'm going to do here, well, first of all, let's still continue with the color grading a little bit. And one other thing with color grading is we will tend to the outer parts of the image. We want that to be less saturated. We want the middle part or the subject to be saturated, and we want the outside of the frame to be less saturated. Again, you're giving the viewer's eyes somewhere to rest. So we have all this color, but if it's not as saturated out toward the outside, that's somewhere for their eyes to rest. Subconsciously, they will like your image if they have somewhere for their eyes to rest. So I'm going to reset effect. And I just so we could see what we're doing, I turn exposure down. This helps me better see where I'm putting the adjustment. And I'm going to do a radial filter that goes like this. And I'm going to have it mainly centered on them. All right. Now I have it inverted, and I don't want it inverted. So we're going to move it this way a little bit. Okay. So we're going to uninvert it by clicking here. So it's affecting the outer parts of the image. Now, this having exposure down helps me see what it looks like and what pixels it's affecting. I think the feathering's a little bit too heavy, so I'm going to pull feathering back. So I'm affecting mainly all around them. Move it this way a little more. Okay. And then I'll reset exposure by double clicking on that. And again, we're not doing like major movements of saturation slider or anything. We're just taking a little saturation out. It's probably imperceptible to many people, but enough so that we're, again, controlling that mental space of the viewer. And if it's just a little less saturated here compared to over in here, they'll tend to look here and then rest their eyes out in here. Also, I want it a little darker. Part of the color grading too and tonal grading is we want the outsides not to be that bright. We want that a little darker as well. So I will turn exposure down just a little bit. So that is that radial filter. So I'm selectively controlling where I put sharpening, where I put brightness with the brush, and where I put other factors such as saturation and darkening of luminance with the radial filter. Now I still want to put more emphasis on them. So I'm going to get a new radial filter by clicking on new. And then I'm going to put a radial filter on them. All right, like this. And I do want this one inverted, but I don't want exposure down. In this one, I want exposure up. And just a little bit. Just, just a little bit. Just to kind of put a little more emphasis on them as a couple. A little. I think that looks pretty good. Now, here's before the two radial filters. And here's after. Now you can see how we're controlling the mental space of the viewer. We're getting emphasis on them. And that might be just a little bright. So I'm just going to bring that down. So that looks pretty good. Now it's really kind of dark over in here under the tree. So I'm going to put a new radial filter there. We'll go out here like this. Like that. And again, we're going to just brighten that up, not darken it down. So we'll move that to the right. It just, we have something very subtle here. We have these lines going kind of horizontally through the image. So we have this line here going horizontally. We have the ridge here going horizontally. We have the way the grass is cut going horizontally. But right here, it's more circular. So it adds just a little bit different subtle texture, kind of emphasis on that subtle texture to the image. And I think that works. I think that helps add to the image. So we kind of have this look and, not bad, right? So I think I'm actually done. Now you'll notice I didn't do any detail here. Now, noise reduction was shot with a really good camera. There's really very little noise. What I will do, though, is I see a little noise in the sky, and there really isn't any noise anywhere else. And mainly their skin, there's no noise at all. So that noise in the sky, what I'll do is I'll get a brush, and I'll reset it by double clicking on effect, and I'll go to noise and I'll move that to the right. And I have my brush. I'm going to use auto mask, so I'm only removing the noise from the blue sky. And I'll just brush on there on the blue sky. So I'm, again, I could go to the detail tab, right? and do it there, but it softens everything. And I don't want to soften everything. I want total control of the pixels that I'm processing. And here I have total controls. There to the right, quite a bit. Zoom back out. So I think that's it. I think that's done. There's before and there's after. Before, after. That radial filter on them might still be a little bright. And what I'll often do is walk away for a while to rest my eyes and then come back to it. And often I'll readjust things slightly so that it might still be a little. So I'll bring that down like that. And there's before and there's after. It even looks brighter when I do a before after because they're relatively dark compared to the background and the sky. And then when I show the processing, all of a sudden they brightened up like they have a spotlight on them, and it looks maybe overdone. So again, I'll walk away, rest my eyes, and come back, and most often it will look okay. So that's how a professional goes about it. And the main thing I wanted to try to communicate is it's very selective. We use selective sharpening. We use selective noise reduction. We use selective saturation. We use selective luminance adjustments. All this done selectively because, first of all, when we're taking the image, we're very conscious of the depictive space. We're choosing what to include, what to minimize, what to maximize in the frame because we have this, again, we have this kind of messy world and we're selecting what's in it. Then when we're processing, we're also keeping in mind that depictive space, but we're also processing for the mental space, how the person is that's going to be looking at our image. We want to make sure that it's not so saturated it causes fatigue on their eyes, and we want to make sure that everything isn't sharp because that will cause fatigue on their eyes as well. So we want to make sure that where we want them to look is sharp and saturated, but everywhere else, or most everywhere else, is less saturated and not as sharp. It gives them a chance to rest their eyes. So I hope that made sense. If you guys would like me to do more videos like this, more kind of these advanced photography videos, advanced color grading videos for different types of scenes, this is how we might do an engagement shot or maybe even a wedding photo like this. But it would be different for a portrait, a head and shoulders portrait. It would be different for, let's say, a shot of an animal, a wildlife, something like that. Let me know in the description below, and I'll do some videos that cover that a little more readily, a little more thoroughly for those different types of photographs. Also, I want to add real quick, this image here to finish it off, I would take it in Photoshop and get rid of this branch. I could do that in Lightroom. It's just a lot easier in Photoshop and would take me 10 seconds in Photoshop. So again, that's it. Thank you everyone who watches my videos. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.